Xenon was such a big deal, in fact, this was one of the first reactors that was ever built. This was the Hanford reactor in Washington. They built this during the Manhattan Project to make plutonium for nuclear weapons. And when they first built it, they turned it on and everything seemed to be going. And after about a day or two of running it, all of a sudden the power went pew and dropped like almost to zero. And they were like, what the heck is that? And they couldn't figure it out and they left it alone. And after about 12, 18 hours, all of a sudden it went and it came back up to power again and it held there. And they're like, what? And then pretty soon it goes pew and it drops off again. They're going, this makes no sense. We're not doing anything. The thing's like turning on and it's turning off and it's turning on and it's turning off. Well, what was going on was the reactor would turn on and Xenon-135 would begin to build up. And as it built up, it would start eating all those neutrons, right? And then it would pew, and it would take the reactor back down again. And then after a while, it would decay away. And once it decayed away, the reactor would come back on again. So it was following this up and down effect. Just crazy. I mean, these guys didn't even know what Xenon-135 was because this was like one of the first nuclear reactors ever built. Well, luckily for us, the guy who built this reactor was this guy, Eugene Wigner. He was unbelievably brilliant. Maybe one of the smartest guys who ever lived. Won the Nobel Prize. Like he would just lay in bed trying to figure out how far ahead of the Germans are we? Are we going to get the bomb before them? What's going to happen if they get it? Where do you think they are? I mean, he was just always gaming it and trying to figure it out. He had thought, what could possibly go wrong in this machine I built? He goes, well, there could be something that we'll make that will be very, very absorptive of neutrons. We might make something. And that something we make might decay quickly. And if it was really absorptive and it decayed quickly, the reactor would do this. He didn't know what it was yet. He just was hypothesizing that such a thing existed. And so when this machine of his started doing this, he goes, I think I know what's going on. Well, the good thing was he had over-designed this reactor so there were a bunch of extra places to put in extra fuel, and he was able to override this effect. I mean, we're really lucky he did this, or we would not have been able to finish the Manhattan Project. So they were able to complete the creation of plutonium in order to make the first nuclear weapon. This looks like an eye, doesn't it? This is like Lord of the Rings, the great eye is looking at. No, it's really not an eye. Here's what it really is. It's a cross-section of nuclear fuel. This is uranium oxide, and when you put it in a reactor for a while, one of the things xenon does, it's a gas, so it's way, way, way less dense than solid fuel. So when you make this gas, it starts to break up the solid structure of the fuel. And when you run these reactors long enough, the solid fuel will begin to swell and crack, and the gases, the krypton and the xenon will begin to fill up, and you begin to get this central void. This is actually a gap in the fuel that will form under the fission process as fission product gases will accumulate here. Well, Wigner didn't like solid fuel. He was a chemical engineer by training, and he thought, what kind of industrial process do we run chemically based on solids? He goes, we don't. Everything we do, we use as liquids or gases because we can mix them completely. You can take a liquid, you can fully mix it. You can take a gas, you can fully mix it. You can't take a solid and fully mix it unless you turn it into a liquid or a gas. Now to give you an idea, here's what we do today. We make this solid uranium oxide fuel, and there's a single pellet, and then we put them in these big reactor fuel elements, zirconium tubes that are like 12 feet long and about this big around. Then we stick them in the reactor, we irradiate them for a couple of years. We only burn up a small amount of the uranium that's in there. We take it out and we stick it in a spent fuel pool. It is not very efficient. With our reactors in the United States, we're extracting about 0.5% of the energy that's in the uranium. With your reactors here in Canada, you're extracting about 0.7%. So, yay Canada! All right! Woo! Slightly less inefficient than we are. Feel good. Now, if any engineers out there are excited about less than 1%, you can imagine going to your boss saying, I developed a new system. Well, how efficient is it? It's less than 1%. Excuse me, what did you build? I think you need to go work on that again. I mean, we just simply wouldn't accept this. Why we accept this in nuclear is still kind of confuzzling me. Wigner did not accept it. He didn't like it at all. And he said, listen, here's what we need to do. We need to build nuclear reactors that aren't based on solid fuel. We need to build nuclear reactors that are based on liquid fuel, because liquid fuel is going to be a whole lot better at doing a bunch of things. It's going to be easier to add fuel to it. It's going to be easier to take fuel out. And best of all, that xenon problem that we had back in Washington, that's going to just go away. This was another form of liquid fuel that was investigated. He started out with something based on water, but then rapidly had the idea of looking at salts. salts have a lot going for them inside a nuclear reactor. A nuclear reactor is a rough place for normal matter. You've got a lot of neutrons that are slamming into things, knocking things around. You've also got gamma rays that are just blasting apart typical bonds between atoms. The nice thing about a salt is formed from, well, a real simple salt. You know, there might be some chemists in here that will challenge this. But a real simple salt is formed from a positive ion and a negative ion. Like you take sodium and it loses its electron to chlorine, for instance. Chlorine says, give me that electron. Now chlorine's got an extra electron and sodium's missing one. So sodium's positively charged and chlorine's negatively charged. And they go, hey, let's kind of hang out with each other. You know, we're not really going to bond. We're just going to kind of associate one with another, you know. And that's what's called an ionic bond. Some people say, well, that's not really a bond. It's like, yeah, you're kind of friends. You know, you're not really married or anything. You just kind of hang out, you know.
Facebook friends.
Facebook friends. All right, well, it turns out this is a really good thing for a reactor because a reactor is going to take those guys and just smack them all over the place with gammas and neutrons and everything. And the good news is they don't really care who they particularly are next to. As long as there's an equal number of positive ions and negative ions, the big picture is happy. So it turns out salts are a pretty dang good idea for a medium inside a reactor. And this was Wigner's idea. He said, okay, you know, regular matter's just going to get the snot kicked out of it. Why don't we put in salts? And then there was another really, really cool thing about salts. You want to be able to move the heat that's generated in the reactor around. You want to be able to move it to the power conversion system that's going to turn the heat into electricity. When we use water as a coolant, in our water-cooled reactors, be they heavy water, you know, oh Canada, or be they light water, you know, God bless America, you know, either way, water is a tough medium to use in a reactor. Number one, it's only got 100 degrees of liquid range, okay? 0 to 100 C. So that's not really particularly impressive. So to jack up water's liquid range, you have to put it under pressure. And our reactors, both in the US and Canada, put water under extreme pressure. About 90 atmospheres in a CANDU, about 150 atmospheres in an American reactor. So I'm a scuba diver, you know, 3,000 PSI is about what your scuba dive tank is. Now, make that tank 10 meters across, full of, you know, nuclear fuel. And you see, it's kind of a little bit of a challenge to do that. But we do that because that's the only way to get water to go up to 300 degrees C without turning into steam. You have to have that extreme pressure. And I would put out to you for consideration that super high pressure is one of the basic challenges, difficulties, flaws, whatever you want to call it, of the water-cooled reactor approach. The salts, on the other hand, you have to heat them up to about 300 C before they melt. But once they melt, they have 1,000 degrees C of liquid range. And they have excellent heat transfer properties. They can carry a lot of heat per unit volume, just like water. Water actually is really good from a heat transfer perspective. It's good at carrying heat per unit volume. Salts are just as good at carrying heat per unit volume, but salts don't have to be pressurized. And that, if you remember nothing else of what I say tonight, remember that one fact. Liquid salts can carry heat from the nuclear reactor environment, and they don't have to be pressurized. And that is just a humongous deal, because almost every good thing flows out of that. A salt, in a way, is kind of like a noble gas. It's got a full electron configuration. A noble gas fills up its outer layer with electrons. A salt is composed of the stuff that's in this column, the halogens, and the stuff that's in these columns, the alkalis and the alkaline earths. That configuration put together behaves a lot like a noble gas. It's very, very stable. So these salts, they don't want to react with anything else. This is another very, very good feature in a reactor. You don't want to build a reactor out of stuff that wants to be something else. It wants to burn, react, anything. You want to go, whatever I've made you out of, I want it to be like the rock bottom of stability. I don't want there to be no step further down that is chemically favorable, because that's how things burn. Fluorine is so reactive with everything, but once it's made a salt, a fluoride, then it's incredibly chemically stable and non-reactive. So sometimes people go, oh, you're working on liquid fluorine reactors. No, I am not working on liquid fluorine reactors. We're working on fluoride reactors, and there's a big difference between those two. One is going to explode, the other one is like super duper stable. So this salt that we favor is actually a combination of lithium fluoride and beryllium fluoride. And individually, they both have very high melting temperatures. Lithium fluoride like 850 C, beryllium fluoride about 550 C. But if you put them together in the right combination, you can nurse that melting point down. This is called the eutectic. You can nurse it all the way down to about 360 C. Now that's still hot, but that's about the temperature you want to start running your reactor anyway. If you're not putting heat in your reactor at a high enough temperature, you can't drive a power conversion system efficiently. This is why we have to have pressurized water. Water is really hurting just to get even close to this point, to get water pressurized to that point where we can start adding heat. But ideally, the higher temperature we can go, the better the system is going to work. Now into that lithium-beryllium mixture, we then add other things, either thorium fluoride or uranium fluoride, and it's still mostly lithium-beryllium. We only add a small amount of thorium-uranium fluoride. Now what about thorium and uranium? Well, let's talk a little bit about what's in them. Both are naturally occurring materials. Thorium has only one isotope, thorium-232. It has a 14 billion year half-life. So when the universe is twice as old as it is now, thorium will have only decayed one half-life. Okay. So based on what I just told you about radioactivity, what does that tell you about how radioactive thorium is? Hardly at all. Means no big deal. That's why it's still around. Okay, uranium, two isotopes, uranium-235, uranium-238. Both, of course, are radioactive. U-238 has a 5 billion year half-life. That's pretty old. That's about how old the Earth is. That's how old the Earth is. That's how old the universe is. So uranium-235, on the other hand, much shorter half-life, 700 million years. So that means back when the Earth was formed 5 billion years ago, there was a lot more uranium-235 back then than there is now. Somebody wondered one time, okay, billions of years ago, that means there was a lot more uranium-235 and natural nuclear reactors might have been possible. I wonder if a natural nuclear reactor ever happened. And they found out it did. It probably happened in many places, but there's one place in particular that we found in Africa at a place called Oklo in the Gabon. And they found, based on the certain leftovers from fission, they were able to identify that about 3 billion years ago, there were scores of natural nuclear reactors there that were nothing more than uranium ore in the rock, and the water would come in and it would lead to a nuclear reaction. And these reactors ran for hundreds of millions of years. So this is like absolute, nature hacking on the building blocks of the world and built itself a nuclear. So we did not invent nuclear fission. All right, it was done long, long, long before we were here, and very successfully. And one of the interesting things they've been able to figure out at Gabon is they've been able to do experiments. I'm like, okay, let's say you had a nuclear reactor where the sea was just totally washing in. How far do fission products and plutonium and other things get? And they were able to figure out the answer was not nearly as far. And it helped them benchmark certain models with regards to Yucca Mountain. Total aside, but I think it's just super interesting that nature was able to pull off a natural nuclear reaction. Okay, how common is this stuff in the Earth? Well, it's not super common, but it's not super uncommon either. Okay, what is the crust of the Earth made of? If you had a ton of stuff, how many grams are each thing? Most of the Earth's made out of oxygen. Isn't that strange? Like 46% of the crust of the Earth is oxygen. Whoa, really? Seriously? It's because everything's oxidized, all the rocks. So then silicon, aluminum, iron, calcium, a bunch of stuff. Okay, we get down here. Well, here's thorium at 10 parts per million. But there's other stuff that we think of that's, even less common. Beryllium, tin, tungsten. Here's uranium, 2.5 parts per million. Tungsten, molybdenum, mercury, silver. No surprise, where's gold? That's why girls want you to give it to them, because it's so darn rare. Well, I guess they also want you to give them carbon too, but they want the carbon in a very, very particular form. Now let's say we were looking at uranium-235 as if it was its own thing, okay? Not as if it was, it's less than 1% of uranium. It's about 0.7% of uranium. So I put on this chart and I said, okay, this isn't really real, but I'm just going to think about it anyway. If this was uranium-235, you can see that uranium-235 is on par with the abundance of silver and platinum. All right. Can you imagine burning platinum for energy? I mean, that would just be nuts. And it is nuts. And that's literally what we're doing with our nuclear energy sources today. We're burning this extremely rare stuff. And we're not burning the common stuff, the uranium-238 and the thorium. We're leaving that stuff unburned. Now, sometimes I get in a little bit of discussion with some people who are kind of environmentalists, and they say, listen, nuclear power is not sustainable, they say to me. They go, this is not a green solution. We're going to run out of uranium. And I said, okay, I will yield that point to you if we're talking about today's nuclear technology. On the other hand, If we start thinking about some of these other things we can do, that story changes. Okay, but yeah, if you just want to burn uranium-235, we will run out of it because we just don't have enough high-grade reserves to go get it. It's not that it's that uncommon, it's just that it's hard to find sources that are rich enough to make it worth mining. Okay, what about thorium? Well, what's so neat about thorium was in this book. So I started learning about it. The basic idea is thorium all by itself is not going to release nuclear energy. But if you hit the thorium with a neutron, and we'll explain where that neutron came in just a minute, the thorium will absorb the neutron and it will turn from thorium-232 into thorium-233. Now thorium-233 only has a half-life of like 20 minutes. So is it really radioactive? Oh yeah, it's smoking radioactive. Really, really hot stuff. You don't want to mess with your thorium-233. It's going to decay into protactinium-233, which has a half-life of about a month. Is this radioactive or less radioactive? Less radioactive, but still pretty darn hot stuff. You probably don't want to mess with this stuff either. And then it will decay over about a month to uranium-233, which has a half-life about 160,000 years. Okay, much less radioactive. Uranium-233, if you hit it with a neutron, it will fission. It will split like that chart I showed you earlier. But the cool thing is, in addition to releasing all that energy, it will release 2 or 3 additional neutrons. So you need one of those neutrons to go find another thorium, and you need another one of those neutrons to find another uranium-233 to continue the reaction. Let me tell you how this stuff was discovered. There was a guy named Glenn Seaborg who worked at Berkeley Labs in California in 1942. This was a guy who had discovered plutonium. And he had, coming off discovering plutonium, he thought, I wonder if we could hit thorium with a neutron and turn it into something. Again, remember, the neutron had been discovered like well, fission had been discovered like 3 years earlier, so they were still in the very beginnings. So he got this grad student, you know, everybody's been a grad student knows what it's like when a professor says, all right, I want you to go into the nuclear lab and turn on the neutron bombardment system and expose this sample of radioactive material and find out what happens. And the grad student's like, it's a war right now, isn't it, sir, right? I could be on the front lines. Yes, you could. Okay, yes, sir, absolutely. Off I go. So the grad student went off and he did the experiment. And he came back to Seaborg and he said, yep, I've done it, sir. I have made something new. Thorium did absorb the neutron. It became uranium-233. Isn't that cool? Seaborg said, yes, absolutely. Okay, now let's take the next step. Poor little grad student. I want you to go back, and now I want you to hit it with a neutron and see if it will fission. Because I think it'll fission. I think it'll fission just like uranium-235. Okay, yes, sir. Goes off, does the experiment, comes back and says, yep, you were right. It did fission. You're correct. It's a new form of nuclear fuel. And Seaborg popped the really, really, really important question. He said, now I want you to go figure out how many neutrons came off when it fissioned. Because if that number is below 2, we really don't have a story here. If this number, you come back and it says it's like 1.5, then interesting fact goes in the back of the book. But if that number is above 2, then that is a big deal. Goes back, comes back. Sir, the number is 2.5. Seaborg looks at his grad student. This is December 1942, and he said, you've just made a $50 quadrillion discovery. Grad student's like, Seaborg was absolutely right. He had figured out that thorium could serve as an essentially unlimited nuclear fuel. And he knew how abundant thorium was in the crust of the earth, and he realized that through this process you could actually sustain the burning of thorium. Now, of course, you're fissioning uranium-233, but you're making a new one. So it's not really a catalyst in the true chemical sense that a catalyst is not consumed in a reaction, but you can almost think about it as a pseudo-catalyst. If you had some uranium-233, you could catalyze the burning of thorium indefinitely. Unlimited cosmic power from thorium.
Installation of a new or repaired reactor, pump, and motor is essentially the reverse of the removal of these components. Occasionally, it is necessary to use the manipulator to assist the crane in positioning the reactor during installation. This operation, like the others, requires experience, care, and patience. Total time for removing and installing the reactor, less pump, is 24 hours. The replacement pump is lowered into position after the O-ring gasket is installed. The new motor follows. This unit and the pump are connected by a self-guiding flexible coupling. After the hold-down bolts are tightened, the electrical connection is made. Removal and installation of the motor, pump, and reactor takes 36 hours. Another component designed for remote installation is the electric preheater. These units heat loop piping to 1200 degrees Fahrenheit prior to filling the loop with fuel. The four heater and thermocouple leads are disconnected first. As the preheater lifting handle is pulled, the hinged section spread out and the unit is withdrawn. The replacement heater is then lowered and locked into position by pushing down on the handle. The first step in replacing a heat exchanger is the disengagement of 23 thermocouple and heater leads. These connectors are hung nearby for easy pickup and reconnection. 8 forced air cooling lines servicing the 4 heat exchanger flanges are also disconnected. Once again, the special tool is used to loosen the flange clamp bolts. The bolt runner unscrews both bolts in each clamp, using socket extensions on the lower clamps. Wedges are installed to hold the pipe in position on the sliding spring supports during the jack screw loosening operation. The hook on the jack screw is engaged, permitting movement of the heat exchanger horizontally. The jack screw control arm is actuated until the heat exchanger is free from the piping. The hook is disengaged to permit removal of the heat exchanger. The overhead crane is then hooked to the lifting eye. Cautiously, the operator maneuvers the heat exchanger out of its support stand to complete the removal operation. A replacement heat exchanger is lowered onto the dolly track of the support stand. Then the unit is pulled into position for engaging the jack screw hook. After the hook is engaged, the control arm is actuated to mate the flanges. Finally, the wedges are removed. Total time required for removal and replacement of the heat exchanger is 24 hours. The life expectancy of reactor components is estimated to be years. The 36 hours required in replacing the most difficult component in the mock-up, therefore, constitutes a negligible cost item if such efficiency can be achieved on a real molten salt reactor. Other advantages of the molten salt cycle include high thermal efficiency, the possibility for thermal breeding, and low fuel cycle costs. The operations photographed at this facility indicate it is feasible to remove and replace remotely components of a molten salt reactor without direct or semi-direct manual assistance. The maintenance operator can be several hundred feet away from the reactor and still perform the necessary operations. Since there is increasing interest in many types of reactors in which fission products are not entirely confined to fuel elements, the procedures developed at this facility are expected to assist designers of other type reactors.